Last week, as we were talking about the superiority of Jesus to the angels and to creation, Hebrews chapter 1, verses 4 through 14, we came up on the question of who are the sons of God in Genesis chapter 6. And after class, someone had some questions about that, and I realized that, the standard response to that is something that of course, I have a different idea about. So I thought it might be useful for us to look at Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 12, and really talk about the sons of God and the daughters of men, as that is a question that came up. Also, it is a teaching that we have in the Baptist Church that is quite prevalent, and of course, as there are some other teaching, I have a little different opinion on based upon Scripture. But so let's look at this and talk about it some, because Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 12, this is New International Version, it's a difficult passage. There's words, there's phrases, there are things that are within that passage that really, as you read over it, can kind of stump you a little bit. And one of the first things that we are faced with in just the beginning of chapter 6, when men began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Is these first two, and you could read on down through verse 4, then the Lord said, my spirit will not contend with man forever, for he is mortal, for his days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. When the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them, they were heroes of old men of renown. Is this more of a summary of the genealogy of chapters 4 and 5? Or is it an introduction to the flood that occurs later on? As we noted when we were looking at Matthew chapter 24, Jesus said that as it was in the days of Noah, so would it be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man, that really what we see in the first 4 verses 1 and 2 in particular, Jesus looked at as more of just a state of affairs of Adam's descendants, rather than an introduction to the flood. Chapter 4 and chapter 5 of Genesis gives to us the list and general description of the children of Cain and the children of Seth, as they represent the spiritual division of the inhabitants of the earth after Cain's murder of Abel. And both groups began to fulfill the direction that was given to Adam by God: be fruitful and multiply. Chapter 6, verse 1, when men began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them. That's just a natural outcome of people being people, And through the spread of Seth's descendants, the worship of God, of the God of Adam, began to grow. As you look in chapter 4, verse 26, at that time men began to call on the name of the Lord. People began to be associated either with calling on the name of the Lord or following the more earthbound religion of Cain. You remember that was the thing that irritated Cain so much when Abel brought his offering from the flock, which mirrored and remembered what God had done for Adam and Eve. He had slain animals and covered them with skins. Then Cain brought of the fruit of the ground, and God had more respect for Abel than for Cain's, and Cain got mad about that, and Seeing how he couldn't do anything against God, he killed Abel, murdered him for that. So, the distinguishing and the identification of Seth's line and Cain's line began to grow. Chapter 4 notes that violence, polygamy, and centralized civilization in cities began with Cain and his descendants. You can read that. Not that there weren't failures in Seth's line, of course, but their genealogy was characterized either by Seth or by Cain's. Because if you remember, of Seth's line, Noah was the only one. He and his family were the only ones out of Seth's line that were saved from the flood. So not all of Seth's line were, true believers. So if chapter 6, verses 1 through 4 is seen as a summary of chapters 4 and 5, then, much of the debate over the specific phrases in this section is reduced. As Matthew chapter 24, verse 38 and 39, and 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 19, note, this generation were as a group first focused upon their own pleasure and life instead of obedience and devotion to God. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 4 that as in the days of Noah, they were married and given in marriage and just living life with a focus on life rather than on what God was telling them through the preaching of Noah until the day that Noah went into the ark. And the flood came as a surprise to the world of that day. Not a surprise because they didn't hear of it, but a surprise because they ignored the message. And when it did happen, they were like, what's this? Now, this emphasis on selfish pleasure would eventually lead to the corruption and violence that is stated in chapter 6, verse 11, when the Lord said that the world was corrupt. Verse 11, now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. We'll look at some of this unfolding as we go into it. However, there are specific phrases in these verses that have created debate and confusion as to just exactly what is being talked about, which is what prompted this little side discussion from the book of Hebrews. Now, there are three basic areas in this section that we want to look at, followed by a general question that comes up about it all. And the first is, and by the way, folks, if you cannot read my writing, do not despair. Nobody in the room can. I've been teaching for 11 years, and it hasn't got any better. So, if you don't understand something, please ask, because they have asked, because I can look at their faces and they go, that is perfectly okay. Now, the first question that comes up is, who are the sons of God and daughters that's daughters, just take my word for it, of men? Who is that? Who are they? And that was the question that came up last week. The basic teaching that I have heard and have been challenged with at times is that this phrase refers to fallen angels, that these were the reference to sons of God is fallen angels. And you've heard that probably in preaching, being taught. I've heard it, preaching, being taught, things like that. But if we see verses 1 and 2 as a summary of chapters 4 and 5, it becomes easier to understand that the phrase sons of God were those of the line of Seth, and conversely, the daughters of men were those of the line of Cain. Now, there have been different interpretations of this. There's three main interpretations that I gathered in studying on this. One, of course, is, as I've said, the godly and ungodly lines represented by Seth and Cain. Two, that these were fallen angels who didn't accept or keep their given places of authority and left their home. And sometimes the reference is made to Jude, verse 6, of angels who left their first estate, left their first position. And thus the daughters of men, if in that case, would represent all the women of earth. Now, the strength of this argument, and why it's probably been so pervasive through the years, is that, and we've noted this in our study of Hebrews, that there are places in the Old Testament where the phrase sons of God does refer to angels. Job chapter 1 and Job chapter 2 is an example of where there came a day and the sons of God gathered themselves together, Job 1 and Job 2, and Satan came among them. So, it's obvious that there are spiritual beings being referred to at that point, angels. And Satan came among them, all being responsible to God. And, this is the strength of this. And though it's an attractive idea, there are several difficulties to this. And the first is that the whole account of the flood deals with who? Noah and his family and the structure of the world. The flood was not a judgment on angels. The flood was a judgment on man. The whole episode was about what man had been doing, not what angels had been doing.
But wouldn't that knock them both out? If they were mortal fallen angels, they'd lost most of their power. If he floods the earth, they're going to drown like the humans, right?
If that's so. But at the point right here, how do we know that he's speaking of angels? We really don't. We really don't. We have.
He is. He can kill two birds with one stone.
Oh yeah. Except for the fact that angels are immortal, and
the biggest argument I've heard is that the original text calls them B'nai Elohim, which is angels, and that's what's used in the church.
yeah, and like I said, that's the strength, of that phrase. Except for the fact, and once again, this is not something that we're going to fall out over. If you say no, I think they're angels. Okay. Huh?
It's not like the rapture.
Not like the rapture. Yeah, where I'm right, y'all wrong. If you think they're angels, that's fine. I'm not going to fall out with you. I personally don't think they are, so please don't fall out with me over that. But in explaining why I think that this is man, is that the whole account deals with man, says nothing of judgment of angels. And you would think if he was going to drown the angels, who of course are immortal to begin with, it'd be kind of hard to do that in the flood at the same time. Also, even though angels in the Old Testament took human form, there are several places where angels appeared and they looked as human as any of us, When the angels came to the home of Lot, later on in the book of Genesis, they appeared just as human as anybody else. As a matter of fact, when Lot's house was set upon by the homosexual crowd of that day, they said, bring these men out. They called them men. They didn't call them angels because they looked like men. Even though they took human form, they are spiritual creatures. By essence, and are, according to Jesus in Matthew chapter 22, verse 30, they're sexless beings. And it seems to me to think that when God cast Lucifer and his followers out of heaven, that part of the judgment was to give them the ability to procreate. That is hard for me to accept, that to sound very crass, that they grew an appendage when they came out of heaven, you know. That just seems to be, to me, it's a head scratcher. I just can't quite fit that in. It's possible, but I don't see how it could be. If angels are sexless, they were thrown out of heaven, they probably are still sexless. And there's a third belief you may have run into, and this refers that the passage here in 6:1 and 2 refers to an ancient line of kings who were great and powerful and kept multiple harems. So they married any of them they chose. They used that phrase to say that these great kings just had big harems and they, you know. And however, there's nothing to really substantiate. Once again, you have to read into the verse to come up with that. It's not stated in the verse. And then there's a fourth idea, that the sons of God, this kind of goes back a little bit to what Brad was saying a while ago, that the sons of God were demoniacs that were possessed by fallen angels. And their offspring were the groups mentioned in verse 4, the Nephilim and the heroes of old, men of renown. And this is possible. This is possible. But once again, you've got to kind of read into the passage things that are not specifically stated.
There's plenty of times in the Bible they do possess. Demons do possess people.
Yes. So I wouldn't just argue against that line of thought. I wouldn't do that. It's possible that these were people who became possessed, and in their own sinfulness, their possession by demons just exacerbated their carnal natures. That's possible. But it seems to me that this and the idea that the sons of God were the descendants of Seth, daughters of men were the descendants of Cain, in the sense of spiritual identification, probably is the easiest way of looking at this passage, although that they may have been possessed is not something I would just discount right off hand.
But if the flood did, at least get rid of those.
Yes, and they got rid of those, and you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to be concerned about whether God how did God try to kill angels, you know, with that idea, pardon me, you know, sniffles and so forth. So I think that's the best way of understanding the idea of sons of God, daughters of men. It was a spiritual designation. And we'll run into this idea of spiritual designation when we start talking about the Nephilim. Because these people, this group, were not so much an individual tribe, nation, or group of people as much as it was people who were powerful, people who were evil, people who had great abilities that they used for evil, because we see them mentioned again in Numbers chapter 13, verse 33. Remember when the spies came back, they said, we can't go into the land of Canaan and conquer them. We look like grasshoppers to them. We saw the Nephilim. Well, if the Nephilim were a group of people, they all drowned in the flood. I don't think any of them snuck on the boat. You know what I'm saying? So, you know, they all drowned. So to have a reference to them in Numbers 13 is more of a inclination toward a spiritual designation. That these were people that perhaps they were strong, perhaps they were tall, perhaps they were big. Maybe that's what helped them in their warrior prowess. I wouldn't argue against that, but at the same time, I think it's more, you know, a person is a Nephilim. The word itself means fallen one. And it could, you know, fallen one you could worship as a great ancestor or whatever. Or it could be the fact that they were just that evil and they prided themselves on their arrogance and independence of God. And they gained a reputation that out of their evil and all that they had done, God didn't do nothing to us. We ain't scared, you know, type thing, until the day that Noah entered into the ark. Questions? Okay. Second point that comes up, what is meant by my spirit will not contend with man. And I'm going to slash it here. For he is mortal. What do you think that means?
Exactly what it says.
Which is?
If you're not going to follow him, he's going to take care of it. Right here.
Okay. So, God's not going to put up with it but so long. But did he get rid of man's mortality in the flood? No.
But the good part. Save the good part, right?
You have to ask Ham about that after the flood.
As good as he could do for that.
Huh?
As good as he could do for that.
Yeah. So, you know, that's it's one of those phrases, once again, it's a little difficult to figure out, okay, if you know, if God will not always contend with man, the word contend here carries the idea of a governmental action. And yes, I think it does say that, it does imply and say that God will not just allow the world to roll on without bringing a response from him. I think that's the simplest way to understand my spirit will not contend with man. I think that's the simplest. Although there are some people who say, you know, that's why he said 120 years. My spirit will not always allow man to live long. So I'm going to cut it back to 120 years. I have some questions about that, but I think the simplest way is that the spirit will not always contend with man. No, he will not allow the world to roll on in its own wickedness and in its own ways and its own plans without there being a response from him. I think that's the simplest way of understanding that. You know, God has a line that he sees as the point to act on behalf of judgment and mercy for that matter. We see an example of this in Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 24, verse 22, where during the Great Tribulation period, the days are so violent that if God didn't intervene, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, the passage says, the days would be shortened. Zechariah chapter 14, verses 2 and 3 is a joint passage with that. So there are times in God's governmental actions of the world that he has a line that he draws and says, okay, I will put up with, you know. Now, once again, we had the discussion some of predestination. We'll get into some more of that later on. But that God knows, he knew from the beginning all that was going to happen in this. Yes?
According to David Jeremiah, who's got the commentary in my Bible, he says that 120
Yeah, I do. I agree with that 100%. I think so. I think,
Because there's too many people that live a whole lot longer than that on through the Bible to contend that 120 years is all they're going to live.
yeah, it doesn't seem to make a whole lot of common sense to look at 120 years as, okay, you know, this is how long I'm going to let you live now. Because really the 10 people listed in the chapter 4, chapter 5, there were only 10 that had a long life. Not the whole society, not the whole world, but 10 people are listed as having very long lives. So these were particular people that God allowed, but doesn't mean that everybody before the flood lived to be 900 years old. It doesn't say that. And so I don't see how that 120 years fits in as far as a time period of how long man will live. You know, to tell you the truth, I really hope I don't live 120 years. I'm in bad enough shape now that if I live to be 120, there ain't no telling what I'll look like. You know? So I think the 120 is more of the mercy that God is showing, because Peter tells us that Noah was a preacher of righteousness, and he preached, warning the people of earth. God's going, he's drawn a line, and he's going to send the flood. Ha ha, was the response that he got out of all of that. Until the fountains of the deep were broken up, the rain started, and then it was too late for God shut him up into the ark. Now, the statement that mankind is mortal seems to be a bigger problem, you know, in this verse. Because mankind would still be mortal after the flood is gone. Chapter 3, verse 19 makes this very clear after the sin of Adam. So what good would it be to punish mankind for being who they are, mortal? The King James Version translates this word as flesh, which kind of gives the sense more of moral depravity. But we're still faced with the fact that mankind was still carnal after the flood. So, you know, my spirit will not always contend with man forever, for he is mortal. Okay? So, I'm mortal, I'm carnal, and that's why I'm being judged. It almost seems like that the phrase, he is mortal, explains why. You know, it's kind of like B explains A, if you will. Man's continuing carnality is the reason God had to draw a line in the sand of what he would allow to occur. My spirit will not always contend, but the reason for that is that man is carnal. We're born carnal. We live carnal. In that world, carnality grew, and it led to the statement. B led to A, if you will. A is my spirit will not always contend with man. B is the reason or the explanation for that. For he is mortal. He is carnal. Not in the sense that he's going to die anyway, because why? You know, it just doesn't make sense to look at it as he's mortal in the sense of he's going to die. Yes, he is. And in this case, 120 years, yes, he is. So, I think the 120, as we've noted, is a time of patience and of mercy, really. And I think that the idea of mortality here, if we understand mortal in the sense of carnal, man is carnal. He is fallen and is carnal. And as we will see later on in this passage, that carnality reached a place to where God would not contend with that anymore. And we see that is going to come again. The earth at one time was destroyed by a flood, The next time is going to be by fire. Peter tells us this, that God has drawn a line. And in that line that is to come, the judgment is going to fall upon all of mankind again, except those that are his. Now, who are the Nephilim? This should be fun for me to write this out. Who are the Nephilim and the heroes? I'll do it that way. Now, once again, referring back to the King James Version, it has, there were giants in the earth in those days. And also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bore children to them, the same became mighty men which were old, men of renown. Now, there's two basic Hebrew words here. One is a transliteration, the other is a translation. And both words speak of men who were of special note as warriors and wicked leaders. Now, the word Nephilim is a transliteration from the Hebrew. It can be translated as, we've noted a moment or so ago, as the fallen, which may refer to their arrogant independence of their need of God. And a post-flood example of this would be Nimrod, chapter 10, verse 12. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. And that doesn't mean that he just, he was able to kill elephants and rhinoceroses and all this other stuff. He was a hunter before the Lord. He was of the land of Shinar, of Babylon. He was an enemy of God. He hunted God's people. That's what he was as a mighty hunter before the Lord. So we see this idea of arrogant independence in Nimrod, and that these men may have attained their prowess from their size may be true. But once again, as we noted a while ago, the Nephilim were probably more given this as a group characterization rather than a reference to their size. I'm not saying there weren't giants in those days, but I think the reference is more to the evil of their character, not just to the fact that they were big people. They were perceived as terrible warriors, which is why the phrase was used by the spies when they went into the land of Canaan, and they didn't believe that they could take it. If they were a people, then they all died in the flood. Question on that? Because I'm probably going against a lot of what you have heard and taught for years in this.
So not necessarily giants as we think of giants today.
Yeah, not necessarily so, no. That there were giants in those days. Nephilim would be the word that was used. And through the processes of, Hebrew to Greek to so forth, it came to be looked at as giants. I'm not saying that there weren't any, but I don't know that it specifically demands that we have to look at this as giants.
When you think about the spies, it could have been their mighty evilness more so than their size.
Probably. I think the people that they saw, the cities that they saw, they were secure, they were strong. Canaan was a powerful area. It wasn't a piece of cake, in other words, just to run over and take. And 12 of the spies were totally spooked by what they saw. Did they see large warriors? Possibly, very possibly. But to call them Nephilim, is more of a characterization. They were great, powerful warriors. not just giants maybe in size. They may have been bigger than the average, because the average height in those days probably wouldn't have been much. I don't know if they would have been as tall as I am, you know. And that's getting pretty short. So, you know, anybody 6 foot tall would have been a big man in those days. And if you had someone 6'5", 6'7", 7 foot, then you've got a very large individual compared to the average, you know, size of people. And so I think the Nephilim became more of a designation to them than just a reference to size.
How would you explain Goliath then? Because we've always heard he's a descendant.
I'm sorry?
How would we explain Goliath?
No, I think, yeah, I think he was a giant. I think he was probably at least 9 feet tall. And I think there have been people who were great warriors that were of great height. I'm just saying that in 6'4", I don't know that it's just referring to giants here in Goliath's size. Perhaps, but not necessarily so. But they were great, arrogant, powerful warriors. But that they were all 9 feet tall, I don't know that the passage demands us to saying that. But yeah, I think.
And it was, you know, it was oral history passed down probably from Noah's sons, talking about them pre-flood.
Yeah.
You know, so they're, you know, there's not books at the time, so I'm sure they're.
So the reputation of the men before the flood continued afterwards.
To a big, nasty, moral,
Yeah.
corrupt. So that's just what they could come up with to characterize.
Yeah, we could call Adolf Hitler a Nephilim. He was a giant of evil, although he probably wasn't 6 foot tall. You know, and we wouldn't be in error by calling him a giant of evil. You know, the little short fat man in Korea. You know, as Trump called him, could be a giant. Certainly seems to be a giant of evil, but not necessarily because of his size, you know. But one of the interesting things about all of this in chapter 6 is, how did all of this demand a worldwide destruction? Not only of human life, but of animal life. How is it that God said, you know, we could understand, yeah, I'm going to get rid of this crowd of evil people. But he said, I'm going to kill the animals. What was it about the sons of God coming to the daughters of men, marrying whoever they wanted, and people becoming great and powerful, evil, heroes of old, men of renown, maybe of both sides? Maybe some of these heroes were good people. You know, it doesn't say. But why was it so bad?
Kind of repeated that in the conquest of Canaan too by Joshua.
Yeah.
They did the same thing.
Yeah, killed it all.
Kill it all.
Yeah, don't let anything live out of the cities that they conquered. Yeah.
God's in That's it. His in when he gets that back, he should do what he wants.
Yeah. So, what was it about this? And I think there's several points that come into focus with this. And I'll hopefully wrap up our study with this today. The path to the destruction of the flood began with a preoccupation with earth life rather than spirit life. As Matthew tells us, the people of Noah's day were marrying and giving in marriage. They were preoccupied on this life and its pleasures to the neglect of eternal life. And with this came a compromising of the values of Seth's line with the values of Cain's line. This is how it started. Now, this is most often taught in relating to marriage, and Israel and pagan peoples in the Old Testament, and believers and unbelievers in the New Testament. They were warned against compromising your relationship with God for earthly gratification. Now, the passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 14 through chapter 7, verse 1, is a warning against all close involvements with the world. Now, the problem is that, once you get too closely involved with the world, compromise becomes the pressure point against us as believers. And we get caught up in the entanglements of the world. Now, we have to live among the world. Paul tells us that. Jesus says that. He says in John 17, when he's praying that prayer in John 17, he said, I pray that you don't take them out of the world. Leave them in the world. Keep them from the evil of the world. So the path to the flood began with a preoccupation with earth life and a neglect of spirit life, if you will. Focused on my needs, my wants, my feelings, my goals, my life, apart from what I want or what I think God wants me to do. It's kind of an ignoring of this to be able to do this. That's how it began. I think that's what the message is of verses 1 and 2. And once you have begun compromise in this passage became celebrity. The offspring of those whose focus was earthbound became great men of the earth and their accomplishments. And when wealth, power, lust, and celebration is honored by a society, you then reach a place where it becomes truly a survival of the fittest. And he who has the most toys wins, And part of the celebrity that is recognized in this passage, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, verse 4, and had children by them, they were heroes of old, men of renown. Compromise became celebritized, if that's a word. And they did this without an emphasis or an interest upon God. And then celebrity became lustful ingenuity, verse 5. When man's wickedness, the Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all of the time. Man's wickedness was devoted to fulfilling every inclination of the thoughts of his heart, which was only evil all of the time. With power and freedom to exercise selfishness, the earth became the playground of man's depraved intelligence. And this may be where the involvement of the animal kingdom came in. The animal kingdom may have been vulnerable partners in some form to the wickedness of man upon earth. And, we're seeing that today in our world, that animals are being used in some form for man to be able to accomplish some of his evil ingenuity, if you will. And there may have been a different relationship between the animal kingdom and humanity, because there seems to be a change in some things in chapter 9, verse 2, as you read this after the flood. And then lust, and this is the final part of it, lust became total corruption with violent results. Verses 11 and 12 speak of the perversion or the pervasion of corruption of the earth and the violence that came as a result of the depth of evil. Along with the seeking of power comes the exercise of that power over others. When people's hearts are focused upon themselves and their accomplishments, especially in the face of God, violent pursuit of those goals is a self-justification to force. I think we're seeing that in our world today. And I think it was part of what was going on. So what was it about, you know, it wasn't just verses 1 and 2 that caused the flood. Now, it started the path. So, as we can see from this progression, whenever we ignore the boundaries set by God for a person, a community, or society, we then are open to be led down a path which leads to destruction. And we're walking that same path today. Society ignored Noah's preaching. Society is attacking the preaching of the gospel today. So we are in some ways, as a world, in a worse state than the world was in the days of Noah. So I hope that doesn't confuse you any more than what you were. I hope I was able to help clarify some things with that. And if you say, I think it's a bunch of hokey bit, I'm going to go ahead and believe what I always believe. Okay, that's cool. I ain't going to fall out with you, but just to kind of give you a sense of what I think these passages are talking about. And to our visitors, thank you for putting up with me for today. I hope I have not caused you to say, I ain't never walking back in there again. But thank you for being here today. Make sure that you let them know that you appreciate them being here.